For more on the conflict in Gaza, Phyllis Bennis joins us. She directs the New Internationalism Project at the Institute of Policy Studies, which primarily focuses on Middle East and United Nations issues. She's also an informal advisor to several top UN officials on Middle East and UN democratization issues, which is definitely a mouthful. We see another extension, 24 hours. What does this mean?
I think that it means that the negotiations on the substantive aspect are going well enough that people are hopeful that another 24 hours, perhaps there could be another extension, another 24, another 48 after that, that there is some hope that there will be an agreement signed. Clearly, it's not over yet, and the disagreements still exist. We just heard in your report that this agreement, as far as they've reached so far, does not actually lift the blockade. The blockade that has kept the 1.8 million people in Gaza essentially imprisoned since 2006.
That's key, don't you think?
That's absolutely key. So the question will be, if there's an easing, what does that mean in the real world? In November of 2012, the last time there was this kind of Israeli assault, Hillary Clinton negotiated or helped to negotiate a ceasefire. Article 1C of that ceasefire agreement said that within 24 hours, implementation of the opening of the border crossings should begin. It never happened. So that was a big part of why tensions rose again over that year and a half. So I think the question of implementation is going to be absolutely key. It will also be key whether the Palestinians are prepared to accept only a partial lifting. If the fishermen are allowed to go 20 kilometers out, which is what they're guaranteed anyway, but haven't been allowed to implement that, that would be very important. If the Rafah crossing, the crossing into Egypt, is opened to allow people to come and go, to breathe, to get the patients to be able to get decent medical care, to allow in the Israeli crossings, to allow the material to begin the process of rebuilding, that will be key. Now, if that doesn't include actually opening the gates to Israel to allow people to pass over to the West Bank, to students who have scholarships in the United States, for instance, who for years have not been able to take them up because they can't get into Israel to get to the US Embassy to get their visa, if that could be opened. So we don't know yet what an easing will actually look like, but that's going to be key.
Robert Seri at the UN today was talking about the two key components, Israel, their security concerns, and of course the lifting of the Gaza blockade. And yet these are the huge sticking points still. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, yes and no. I mean, the notion that Israel wants to be secure, the reality is Israel is, depending on which sources you rely on, either the 4th or the 11th strongest military power in the world. There's no comparison. We can't really make that comparison about security. Now, the notion that they're concerned about security, yes, of course, there have been illegal rockets sent into Israel that have attacked civilians. Luckily, hardly anyone has been hurt or killed by them, but that's a matter of luck. So that is important. But the way to end that is to stop imprisoning Palestinians, stop the occupation. Those will stop the possibility of rockets. What the Israelis are talking about now is limiting somewhat this strip of what they call the no man's land inside Gaza that goes across the entire border of Gaza, but on the Gazan side, not on the Israeli side, that Israel occupies. And they define it as a shoot-to-kill area. Any Palestinian that wanders into that area by mistake, in one case it was a mentally disabled young man who was also partly hard of hearing, didn't hear, didn't understand. When they called to him, they shot him dead. That, they're now talking about narrowing it, going down 100 yards for a month and then 200 yards, and by next January, perhaps lifting that. That's a very slow process when you look at how much land is being taken up in that. So the question of how soon can Palestinians see a real end to the blockade is going to be a really fundamental question.
Well, I mentioned Robert Seri earlier. I'll go back to him because I thought this quote was really interesting. Right now, Gaza urgently needs houses, hospitals, and schools, not rockets, tunnels, and conflict. We're seeing an awful lot of the latter and not so much of the 100 installations designed to help Palestinian refugees were damaged, including the Gaza branch of his own office. Talk to me about rebuilding. I mean, it's going to be huge, isn't it?
It's going to be huge. And this is what has happened so many times in the past. Israel destroys in Gaza. Europe pays to rebuild it. Israel comes back and destroys it again. And the Europeans come up with more money, which is important. I don't want to denigrate the importance of the funding of what it's going to cost to rebuild. The estimates are that this attack has caused more than $6 billion worth of damage. But even with that, the question really remains, who is going to stand up to Israel and say, you can't keep doing this? It's not enough for Europe to stand back and say, well, we'll pay for the damage after it's done. Somebody, and it should be the United States, but so far we haven't seen evidence of that, except the new motion to stop the Hellfire missiles from being sent. That's very important. That was the first time we've seen from the Obama administration or any US administration sending a certain weapon to Israel on the grounds that they've been using it badly. You know, many people in human rights organizations and others around the world, Amnesty International has been calling for an arms embargo. But this is the first time we've seen the US respond. Now, that could be an important step forward. If that was combined with the Europeans saying, well, not only are we going to pay to rebuild, but we're going to put some real pressure on Israel so it doesn't happen again, then we begin to see a real shift in what happens on the ground.
Well, we'll keep our eyes open for both of those developments. Phyllis, always a delight to see you. Thanks for coming in.